This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 477, Drupal Association CTO Then and Now. On today's show, we are talking about being the CTO of the Drupal Association, how the job has changed, and how it has impacted Drupal with our guests, Josh Mitchell and Tim Lehnen. We'll also cover automatic anchors as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guests today are Josh Mitchell and Tim Lehnen. Josh has led teams in digital agencies, governments, educational institutions, and nonprofits, including some time as CTO of the Drupal Association. He's currently the founder and principal consultant of M6L. As a full-stack consultant, a typical day could include pair programming with the developer, advising a product manager, presenting to organizational leadership, and reviewing merge requests, and much more. Tim is the current CTO of the Drupal Association engineering team, whose specific mission is to empower the community to build Drupal. He was originally recruited to the DA by Josh in 2014, and he has also recently published a young adult fantasy novel called Fog and Fireflies, which I can confirm is great. I enjoyed that very much. Josh and Tim, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Howdy, howdy.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are John Bacozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hey everyone, I have one topic to drop in today. Everybody knows about AI, right? I just heard about one of the best use cases of AI, and I might be late to the game here, so I apologize if everybody else has already heard about this. But I was recently listening to This Week in Tech, and they were talking about somebody has developed an AI to answer spam calls and keep them on the phone as long as humanly possible.
That's choice.
It is amazing. It sounds like an older British lady, and she's just basically trying to keep them on the phone as long as possible. And I will tell you, some of those spammers, they get very upset when they figure out that it's fake. But
can you imagine looking at a visualization of the call activity across the globe and having this whole portion that's just robots talking to themselves?
Yeah,
like some kind of
that's how far
parasitic
away.
snake eating its tail.
But yeah, I just thought it was interesting, as I'm sure we've all gotten calls of there's a virus on your computer, and we're like, oh yeah, tell me more. Oh, what do I need to do? I need to send you Bitcoin in order to get it off. Got it. I thought that was very interesting, so I thought I would share.
That's awesome.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted headings on your Drupal site to have unique ID values so links can be created to take your users to specific parts of any page? There's a module for that. It's called Automatic Anchors, and it was created in June of 2020 by Chris Komlenik, K. Omlenik of Penn State. And it has a 2.1.1 beta 1 version available, which supports Drupal 8.8, 9, and 10, which brings into question the degree to which it's actively maintained, but it hasn't been officially marked as unmaintained. It does have test coverage and is officially in use by 137 sites, according to Drupal.org. Now, by default, the module automatically generates IDs on H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6 elements within the page content. And even if two headings have the same content, the module will make sure that their ID values are unique, as well as making sure they are internationalization friendly, use hyphens instead of spaces, and are short enough to be useful. The module won't interfere with or change manually added or already existing HTML IDs. And there's a permission to view helpful links on each heading that the IDs generate to make it obvious and easy to copy those ID links. Now, configuration options available include the root element it should look within. So by default, it looks for everything within the body tag, which elements it should get the ID values attached to, and what content to use for the display links, as well as whether or not to generate IDs on admin pages. So let's talk about automatic anchors.
This is potentially exciting to me because this is something that clients ask for all the time. And I end up writing some sort I usually end up just adding something where like, hey, when a paragraph is created, it just adds its ID to the, you know, component dash number ID or something so that there's something on the page when they need it. And then if it's a particular CTA or something, maybe there's something they can enter it manually. So it's a little bit nicer. But this seems convenient because it feels like you can just put it in, but how how many IDs does it end up adding to the page? Does it end up adding like hundreds of IDs to everything it finds? Like, what
I
does that look
I
like?
think the answer would have to be it depends on how many headings that you have on your page. I mean,
Yeah.
for myself, I would probably want to change the root element to look just within sort of the like page content as
Yeah.
opposed to like anywhere on the page, and probably skip like H5 and H6. I mean, I don't know how often those naturally get used anyway, but yeah, you can be more selective if you think that it ends up creating way more links than are actually useful.
I was just talking to one of our new product marketing folks at the DA about the in progress work on the new Drupal.org. And one of the things we were just talking about is anchor links for some of our new landing page components. So I actually might seriously look at this because, yeah, similar to what you were saying, Nick, like you could use a freeform field to establish IDs. You could do all sorts of things on your paragraph components or whatever, or try and auto generate. But this seems like it'd be very convenient to just say, hey, all our H2s and all our H3s get IDs and they're just ready to go. So that could be cool.
Martin, question: does this? I'm assuming this addition of IDs happens on the front end of the site within the Drupal theme, right? And let me give you the full picture before I just like I hit you with like half of a question, right?
Okay.
So like I'm thinking like this is super useful, definitely, but the current site I'm working on is headless. So like if it gets applied to WYSIWYG fields and whatnot within the Drupal database, then great, because that just gets pushed out via API. But otherwise, you might run into issues if this is kind of like only a Drupal theme thing.
So my impression of how it works is that it's adding an attribute to the render array. So I suspect that, I mean, theoretically, you might be able to sort of um, update whatever JSON API or whatever you're using to sort of try and make sure that that gets passed through as part of whatever sort of data you're passing to the front end. But I also feel like, as you say, you could probably do something pretty similar on the front end. And if you're using like Next.js or something like that, there's probably already some kind of a library that can basically just parse the page on output and do something similar there as well.
I have a
Oh,
developer
sense.
that did this on another project, and it's just a few lines of JavaScript. If you know what you're targeting, what I like about the module is it does a lot of the makes it configurable. So you can say I want these elements, and you can permission that little highlighted pound sign that actually lets people see the anchor link is there when they hover over, which I think is kind of cool too. When Martin mentioned this one, I told him, I was like, oh, this is kind of like TOC.js, which stands for Table of Contents JavaScript. It's another module in Drupal that I've used several times that lets you configure on this page or in this article menu. That's all of your headings, for instance. I've never done more than just my H2s though. I'm kind of a purist whenever it comes to that. I'm like, section heading should be enough. I mean, if you have subsections, your editors are probably doing it wrong. I just think if you're using H4s, something's wrong.
Especially if you need to link to all the way down into your H4s, there's probably a good chance that maybe that should be a subpage of a something.
That's going to be a
else.
long title, whatever it is at the H4 level. It's going to be pretty deep.
one thing that I did notice now that I'm looking at the code, it is a front end library that's being added. And I think that means then if you change your content, the IDs will be changed too. So if
Mm.
you can't rely on this to give you kind of a long-term anchor link to something, because if somebody edits the content, that ID is going to change. Now your anchor link is going to break. But if you're using it for some sort of table of contents like thing, but you already have TOCJS, so yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out, Nick. I think on the project page, it might actually use the word permalink somewhere in there. And to your point, if the content of a heading changes, then it definitely will change the ID value. So definitely not a permalink in that sense.
Still a good foundation and maybe useful for a variety of use cases. They mentioned explicitly, for example, that they're kind of emulating the behavior on Drupal.org's developer docs, where we've got some automatically generated anchor links to headers people add to the docs pages. So
Yeah, but then but the thing linking to it is also updated automatically, right?
right,
The
yeah,
documentation. So you
yep,
kind of need both sides of that.
absolutely, yeah. In this case, because it's not assuming these external links, it's the TOC in the sidebar of those docs pages. So
Well, thank you, Martin. As always, another great module of the week. I did see during NedCamp that you were posting new modules in our module of the, module of the week Slack. So I imagine you stocked up over the weekend. If folks wanted to suggest other modules or just chat with you about one that we've discussed, how would people get in touch with you?
We're always happy to talk about modules of the week or interesting modules in general in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
All right, Florida Drupal Camp is coming up. Here's Mike to tell you more.
Hey now, this is Mike Anello, aka Ultimike from Drupal Easy, and I am indeed interrupting the wonderful Talking Drupal podcast to tell you about Florida Drupal Camp. In case you haven't heard, this is the best Drupal event anywhere, not that I'm biased, and we would love for you to join us from February 21st to 23rd for 3 days of pure Drupal goodness. Yes, we'll have a ton of Drupal sessions, and yes, we'll have some amazing low-cost training workshops, and yes, we'll have our famous, amazing taco lunch. And as if that wasn't enough, we've got a stellar lineup of featured speakers, including Lorei Timoney, the product manager for Experience Builder, Martin Anderson Klutz, one of the Drupal CMS track leads, and hopefully familiar to Talking Drupal listeners, and Kat Shaw, a certified web accessibility specialist. So point your web browser to fldrupal.camp and register for the event. And if you've got something to say, submit a session proposal as well. We look forward to seeing you, and now back to the fine folks at Talking Drupal.
Thanks, Mike. It was great seeing you last weekend. And as mentioned, we had NedCamp last week, so videos should be up on YouTube soon if you want to watch a session. John, what'd you think?
It was okay. No, I'm kidding. It was great. It was great to see the Talking Drupal team in person. It was great to see guests and guest hosts. It was great to get ideas for future guests and guest hosts. Karen and Jeff delivered a great keynote, as Nick said. Like, it's going to be on YouTube at some point, so you can go look for that. And I think overall, like, we definitely grew from last year, which is attendance wise, which is good. It might have only been by like 5 or 10 people, but it felt like a lot. I think we probably had about 120-ish people who registered, and I don't think there was much too many no-shows there. So it was just great to get a bunch of Drupal folks together to talk about Drupal stuff and have a good time. So definitely would recommend if you are in the New England area, although that's not a limiter because we had people from all over the country and Canada come and check it out. It's usually happening in November. Next year it will be definitely in November 2025. So
Awesome. And I've been talking about it for the last few weeks, so I need to chat about it a little bit more. But the object-oriented hook conversion issue was committed last week. And I just, it was a lot of work. Very happy that got in. I have to thank Catch and Ghost of Drupal Past for some specific attention, helping me out get through some nasty bugs, and then Catch helping me figure out some of the process for some bigger core commits like this. And
I'm sorry, that's somebody's D.O username.
yeah,
Oh, all right.
Daniel Catchpole. We should have him on the show.
No. I meant Ghosts of Drupal Pat.
Oh yeah, Ghosts of Drupal Pat. Yeah, that's Chex.
Got it. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. He came back as I think it. I'd like to nominate that as one of the best usernames on Drupal.org. By the way, it is. It's pretty clever. But yeah,
it definitely
his
rivals
only username. He has multiple usernames, to my knowledge. So
it does rival John Picozzi quite a bit. Yeah.
But yeah, it landed last Thursday. I think there's been a lot of excitement around object-oriented hooks in general. People have been pinging me with modules they've been converting, and I think Workspace went through and did a post conversion cleanup to like split everything out into their own classes and use kind of the multiple hooks in one method, make that a lot cleaner. So it's exciting to see. Still working through this. I think I run the risk of being known as that hook guy, with how much I've been posting about this and talking about it. But it's good to see this moving forward.
Oh,
on the
that's
theme
awesome.
of next year's Halloween costumes, I feel like you should do a combination of like Drupal and hook, and then you could be that hook guy. Like maybe a blue coat instead of a red coat. I don't know. Just an
And a hook
idea.
hand. Yep.
You can see. All right. So now we can move on to our primary topic. So, Josh, let's start with you. So you were the CTO of the DA for some time. When was that, and what did the job look like when you were CTO?
Well, I was the first CTO of the Drupal Association. The role actually started there in 2014. I want to say it was March or April when I started. And I was there through the middle of 2016. So about 2 years all told. Obviously being the first in the role, a lot of that first year was really just defining what the heck the Drupal Association CTO was.
Yeah.
I mean, we literally couldn't even decide if the title was Drupal.org CTO or Drupal Association CTO, what that meant. It was a lot of hiring. At the time, we were flush with cash from the 2013 Portland DrupalCon, and we actually ramped up. I mean, at that time, we got up to 11.
Yeah. Yep.
I used to joke all the time. We went to 11. But yeah, it was a lot of hiring. It was a lot of kind of establishing the role within the community, because the community was used to doing that all kind of ad hoc through committees and working groups. And there were a lot of people burnt out, I think, prior to the technology team really being built up, because it was right after the great Git migration. So taking Drupal.org off of CVS and moving it to Git was pretty intense. And so it was a real opportunity to try to build up some internal expertise within the DA.
Yes. Old versions of version control systems.
It was, people got to remember that wasn't that long ago. There's some incredible history, right? And on that note, the whole reason we were there is because obviously Drupal is older than Git itself. So Git wasn't an option when the project first picked a version control system. So hence
and we skipped right over Subversion and Mercurial and like all these other versioning systems that were really in the running. I mean, very much in the running at that time. So kind of fortuitous that it was delayed just enough that we hit Git. So
I just had a flashback to Tortoise SVN for some reason, but that's a whole nother show and topic. So Tim, something I just realized about 3 to 4 minutes ago is that you're the second CTO of the Drupal Association.
Correct.
All right. And so you took over the job, it sounds like, based on what Josh said, sometime in 2016. Is that accurate?
That's right. Yeah. So when Josh rotated out, I took over the job in 2016. And actually, I've kind of held a couple of different versions of the role. As Josh mentioned, there was some, in those early days, especially, there was some trying to understand what the purpose of the engineering team would be. I remember one of the very first conversations I wasn't even brought in on exactly when Josh hired me. So he hired me in to project manage for the engineering team, right? We had grown to 11 folks. I was actually, I think, the last engineering hire that you made, Josh.
Yeah, it was
Um,
just before DrupalCon Amsterdam, I think. You didn't get a
yeah,
chance to make it to Amsterdam, but it was like
right.
right around there that
I
we
started
we hired you on.
I started a week later because everyone was going to be in Amsterdam or something, and so I
Yeah.
started almost exactly 10 years ago. On November 3rd. And I was project managing the engineering team at the
Wow.
time. And it was really interesting because in my first week, I observed you on a call with a working group, a Drupal.org content working group. And at that time, you were really, I'm going to say, you were really fighting to establish the like trust and the social capital to give us ownership over things that the community was so used to owning. So there was kind of there was arguments, frankly, about whether or not the DA should change the homepage of Drupal.org to like
Oh yeah.
put any content there about marketing Drupal versus like we had the old map of where commits were happening at one point, right?
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and things like that. Like
Yeah.
there was this. It was tough. There was not a sense of ownership because the DA, and especially the idea of an engineering team at the DA, was sort of a new thing. So I really credit Josh with doing a lot of this hard foundational work to establish what our role should be, what we could own moving forward. And this idea back then that we couldn't, like, that it wasn't our decision, what went on Drupal.org was actually very real at the time. So, it evolved from this, like, so again, as Josh rotated off in 2016 and we kept working from there, we had started some really important conversations, some of which are still going on today. Like Josh, you were there for the very beginning of the credit system.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
By the way, I have a great story around the credit system because there is actually a napkin involved. And the reason I at a restaurant in Austin, Texas, where he kind of presented it to me, and he wrote out what he thought the commit message would look like.
Yeah.
And it was all like at symbol plus sign. Like we were going to have this really elaborate get commit message that turned into the credit system. And we basically talked him off of that ledge and into the idea of making it issue credits so that we could actually track it and do all the reporting and all the great stuff that we do.
Right. And so it wasn't set in stone. You could go back and edit it if you needed to, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And like that was the beginning of looking at options for tooling providers that ultimately wound up at the GitLab decision later on during my tenure, a lot of things. So there was a variety of sort of foundational projects where I think Josh was there at the time where it was like, what is it that a team of staff can do that a community can't do or can't easily do without kind of burning those folks out? What's the difference between how a staff can contribute to the foundation of an open source project and how just pure volunteers and contributors can do that?
Yeah, I have to say too, like it was during that time frame and then really carrying on even after it. But when we were staffed up at that level, we actually did a lot in a very, very short time frame.
Right.
Drupal Jobs launched at that time. We rebranded the site right around the end of that time.
Yep.
Drupal 8 launched, and we stood up the
Yes.
composer facade. Brian Aslett being a huge part of that work.
We took over testing the
Drupal CI, yeah.
Yeah.
Putting Drupal CI onto spot instances on Amazon Web Services instead of relying on hardware sitting in the open source labs down in Oregon State. That was huge. And all of that happened in that really short period of time because we actually had enough staff to throw at it and do some pretty amazing work.
DrupalCon websites, all sorts of things. Yep.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Events.drupal.org all started during that time.
Yeah.
Some great work from Jacob Perry and Emily Nouveau on that platform.
Yep.
So before I move on, I kind of want to circle back. Does that map still exist somewhere in Drupal.org for the commit message location? I
don't-
can't imagine it does,
No,
but
I don't think we shuffled it off to somewhere else. There has been some question about whether or not we could have a sort of subpage to bring something like that back. One of the things, I hate to say it, but I saw a similar thing in another community. I can't remember which one. And someone actually started posting either troll or kind of spam messages in commit messages so that they would be parsed and displayed on the home of this project. So yeah, we can't have nice
man.
things.
So that
I will-
just gave me a little like PTSD, because another big part of the first year was fighting spam.
Yeah.
I don't think people realize how inundated Drupal.org
Some
was.
things never change.
Yep.
There was this Pineapple Express ad that, like, you know, for the movie Pineapple Express DVD or Pineapple Express on Blu-ray. I
Yeah, for
swear
bootlegs.
there were hundreds of those, like, in the comments and pages on Drupal.org, because we had nothing to prevent spammers at that time other than you know, maybe anti-bot and, you know, some
Honeypot,
things
I
that you
think,
can
yeah.
honeypot, yeah, you can subvert pretty easily compared to all the stuff that we put in place with user confirmation and some of the other stuff that went into play.
So how has the DA infrastructure changed over the years? Because it's as somebody outside the DA looking in, the two biggest things that I notice that have been like, as a developer, have been helpful, have been, you know, we now can have merge requests and review changes in a nice interface instead of looking at patches. And the test infrastructure, and some of this is moving to GitLab, and some of it is, you know, some other improvements. But tests now take 10 to 15 minutes instead of 45 minutes to an hour and a half. So
Yeah.
as an outsider looking in and a developer, those are the two biggest things. But I know there's a lot of other stuff that has changed over the years. What am I missing? What else have you guys
Well,
been
you
working
know,
on?
it's funny that you talked about that difference in time, because we actually did a similar back in 2015, at late 2015, early 2016, when the Drupal CI infrastructure was stood up. There was a similar, hey, tests are taking, I want to say they were taking like 2 hours, and we got them down to like 15 minutes on the Drupal CI infrastructure. And now, to get that same improvement, it's requiring all the stuff that's being done on the GitLab infrastructure. So as we grow and the project grows, like, the test coverage has grown, and
Yeah.
you know, similarly, you've got to throw more and more resources at specifically testing. So it's kind of interesting that we've gone through that cycle twice within that 10-year time frame, where it's like, oh, hey, we're back up to over an hour, we got to get it down again, you know.
Right, exactly. There's definitely an if you give a mouse a cookie situation where it's like, once they get fast, you're like, oh cool, we're gonna instrument all these things. And at that time, another thing that was interesting, right? Because again, this was the era of Drupal 8's gonna come out any day now, any day now, any day now. And you know, there were these goals to get close to 100% test coverage and all sorts of things. The amount of test coverage that was added in the Drupal 8 area was huge. So simultaneous with that infrastructure change. But I mean, there's a lot. Josh, you alluded earlier to the Oregon State Open Source Lab. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about, and first of all, we're still there for certain things, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about what that was like. Because one of the very first things that we did when I was hired is we had a field trip down to Corvallis, south of Portland, to actually go check out our server rack. It was really cool.
Did you find the video? I'm just kind of curious.
I know I have it somewhere. Are we airing this? Are we airing this publicly, Josh?
Oh no, I'm fine with it. Yeah, it's totally funny. So, you know the scene from 3 Men and a Baby where they sing "Goodnight, Sweetheart"? We sang the old, well, I sang the old servers to sleep before we took them offline, and that was captured on video. So, yeah, I mean, I remember back in, I guess it was probably 2015 when I was on Talking Drupal back then. It was like episode 98 or whatever. I went back and listened to it a few months back whenever we were talking about having me come on to guest host, and I was like, huh, interesting. I mean, like, I'm talking about all these like servers and stuff, like stuff that we don't talk about whenever it comes to infrastructure anymore, because we tend to put everything up into the cloud and orchestrate it and whatnot. But back then it was still very much, you know, we were putting to sleep some old Sun servers that had been gifted to the Drupal community. And that was such a, you know, that enabled so much. But being able to upgrade those and to have the support from the open source labs they were huge and just making it possible to even have Drupal.org around at that time. So
And
It's
that's
funny,
right.
Go ahead.
He did say Sun servers, Sun microsystems. So yeah,
yeah.
they don't even
I
exist.
I have this funny reoccurring thought in my head of over the 10 years or so, right? You guys got the servers out of mom's basement, which is good. It's good.
Yeah. No, it's really true though. It's kind of how that worked. I mean, the OSU Open Source Lab is a really cool institution, and they still do this today. There are still racks, like I said, so we were 100% on bare metal servers, and before Josh got there, on donated hardware entirely. And then even in that generation, right, we were simultaneously deploying Drupal CI. And by the way, you may be wondering, why was Drupal CI a custom CI system, right? We ran an analysis of trying to run the tests on Travis, and we literally couldn't. They wouldn't run fast enough, and they'd time out at Travis's maximum, kind of Travis CI's maximum thing. Not that Travis is even around anymore, but in the same way. But it was just this whole situation where we had to build this thing, and we built this really sophisticated auto-scaling architecture with Amazon Spot instances, while at the same time having new bare metal hardware, big beefy database servers, and all sorts of things like that. And so we had this really interesting mix, what you call, which you can either call, we had a grab bag of architecture, or we had a hybrid cloud design, right? And and what we've done since then is, of course, we've moved further into the cloud architecture kind of design. As people who look at Drupal.org and see that sort of banner across the bottom of the site know, Tag One Consulting are infrastructure management partners for Drupal.org, which means that they help us run the Kubernetes clusters and run all the other things that are now online powering the new Drupal sites and the back end of Drupal.org and various kinds of things. But we still have servers in the rack at the OSL. And they're hanging out next to, I think, the GNOME project, and there's some Apache Foundation servers and some things. I don't know if they're all still there, but certainly a lot of well-known open source projects were or are still there. And for a lot of that hardware, we're not buying new servers, whole new servers really since that time period when Josh led the last kind of upgrade round together with Rudy Gregar, who's now at the Linux Foundation. But we are repurposing those as VM hosts that can do non-production sites or be used for other kinds of like less critical use cases, right? They're no longer front-end kind of servers, but they're used for those sorts of things. So still a hybrid cloud solution.
I can't believe those servers are still around. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
a little bit floored by that.
We've had to do.
I mean, they were beefy. I mean, we totally overbought at the time because we were like, we may never get to do this again.
Right. Well,
But, yeah.
and no, they're still around. They're getting repurposed, or they've been repurposed as VM hosts in a lot of cases. And we have had to do things like replace failing drive arrays and things like that. And I'll admit, there's one that is one of the replicas for one of the servers that is currently still in use did have a drive failure recently, and they're old enough now that we're having trouble finding those models of drives to recreate those RAID arrays. So like they're just kind of aging out too much. It's not the end of the world because these are all being replaced and everything is now in AWS and all these modern systems, but it's kind of cool to see some of that still living on enough to supplement all the things we're doing.
Now the original servers, right? They were like kind of like donated. Is AWS donating space, or is the DA just kind of like paying for that?
They did back in the day. What are they doing now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they have, over the years, as Josh mentioned, they have periodically offered some number of credits for their cloud systems, right? So fairly substantial, high 5-figure type credit packages to at various points in times to help offset some costs. That goes pretty fast, depending on how much you're going through. Like I've mentioned it before, but we spend $20,000 a month on tests lately. And so, that kind of credit goes
I'm
through.
sorry.
What was that?
It's all your fault, Nick.
sorry.
It's all those tests.
Yes. It's
I
actually,
honestly thought there was a question coming there, and then I realized he was
So,
he
he
was actually
changed
apologizing. It's all good.
25,000 lines
No,
of code.
but-
There's some tests that run.
but
no, yeah,
to be fair,
you think about it, it's
the-
like 75 cents to $1 to $1.50, depending on spot pricing
wow.
to run a test.
oh wow.
And that's how many happen a month. So
So it's basically like a nonprofit discount that we're getting from
well,
Amazon.
we're in their nonprofit program. We occasionally get credits, but we don't always. One of the tricks, I think, that has been tough is we'd like to be, frankly, fully sponsored. We think it would be in the interest of Google Cloud or Azure or AWS or any of these folks. Because we go through periods where, yes, they're able to back us up, and then we might go a year or two where they're not offering any incentives and we're paying full rate. So, I won't call that a permanently solved problem. It's always a negotiation with these folks. And, because they don't want to get in the business of saying everybody who runs open source software gets free services, because these days there's plenty of purely commercial open source projects out there. Unfortunately, it's not hard to make a pass-through nonprofit situation as a workaround to those sorts of policies. So they've been very skeptical and resistant to doing the truly sponsored, fully sponsored things, but we've had some success. And so, I hope we can crack the nut and make it an easier proposition to make it a long-term consistent sponsorship rather than periodic one-offs, but we'll see.
I mean, I think that's one thing a lot of people don't understand about Drupal and Drupal.org is it's probably, I feel fairly confident saying it's probably one of the largest open source projects that has a fully independent nonprofit running the platform.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at all the drama in the WordPress space right now. And that part of the reason why that can't happen in Drupal is because we've created this, we've created this amazing nonprofit, mostly self-sustaining system to keep it out of the hands of a single entity. Believe me, there was plenty of times during those 2 years where, Acquia or Pantheon wanted to just host everything for us. And we were like, well, you can't, because we don't actually fit on your definition of a platform. Like we're not just a website, we're FTP servers and a composer facade and Git servers and all these other things that don't fit on those hosting platforms. And they were dying to say, oh, we're the ones hosting this, but it just wasn't possible. We had to build our own structure.
Yeah. And in addition to that, there's no single entity contributes more than 10%. No single external entity's donations or ad buys or anything with the DA is more than 10% of our budget. It's all diversified. It was all very deliberate choice. And we sort of finally see the underlying benefit of that emphasis on independence coming home to roost just recently. So,
yeah.
So let's move from the Amazon credit system to the credit
Nice segue.
Yeah.
Oh, that was really good.
It's like I've done this a couple of times. So we talked about a little bit about it earlier on. Josh was like, hey, it started on a napkin. But how has it changed over the years? I mean, obviously it's no longer on a napkin as many in the community use it, but I'm curious of how it's kind of morphed and evolved.
Tim, can I start with a little of the backstory and then
Absolutely.
you take it from there, because you know everything going on now. But it was actually really hard to implement a credit system that the community would accept. For the longest time, the organization pages on Drupal.org were alphabetical. And so if you had an underscore in front of your name or 1, 2, 3, you were at the top of the list. I still remember a couple of names alphabetically because there was so much consternation about the fact that these alphabetical companies were at the top.
1A
so the
web
idea,
development was really popular.
yeah, exactly. They were just huge. So that was a problem, but nobody was like, we don't trust the DA to actually implement this. So it took a lot of trust building to even do a credit system to have this idea that you would say, oh, okay, well, you're doing this on behalf of this company, or you're doing it for this company on behalf of this company, because that's also supported in the credit system. It's pretty flexible in that regard. Or I'm just volunteering this because so many people wanted to be able to say there is no company behind this. This is me and only me. And so coming up with that and then being able to do the analysis and put that into place, and then coming up with the original algorithm that said, okay, well, this is what we're going to use as version 1 of the algorithm to say, these are the people contributing. That was all just a ton of work to get community members to buy into the idea, and also to get all of our supporting partners to buy into the idea, because it was a huge change to say this isn't going to be alphabetical anymore. It's not just based on something that we can, mathematically say works this way. We're gonna make the system show the people who are making the biggest contributions, and that was huge. And I know, Tim, y'all have got to have changed the algorithm tons of times over the years.
Yeah, they're
but just continue fighting the bad actors, bad faith actors.
Yeah, there's been a lot of revisions, and there's I would say the biggest things that have changed since the initial implementation. One of the things that hasn't changed is the fundamental way that the issue credit portion works, which is what Josh just described, right? It is myself, either as a volunteer, on behalf of my employer, or on behalf of a client, or some combination, right? That fundamental unit hasn't changed, and that's a really big testament to all the time and effort and the community feedback and everything that went into deciding that that should be kind of the atomic unit of credit. And what was really important about that, not just being a get commit message thing that gets parsed, is it worked for non-code contributions. Like I said, it's not immutable the way get commit messages are, so we could edit it after the fact if someone misattributed something or whatever they needed to do. Like, there are all these things, and it let us have the maintainers be a human layer to choose, okay, all these people have attributed their work, but who do I decide actually earns that credit, right? So that gives those maintainers a moderation level. And we've tuned the algorithm in a number of ways since then, in terms of, it's mostly based on the usage of the project, or whether a project is designated as a strategic part of a strategic initiative. Those things get boosts in various sorts of ways. And that's kind of still been the core, but then we've expanded it to another of other things, right? So there's credit for case studies, there's credit for being parts of the certified partner program, there's credits for sponsoring events now, there's credits for all sorts of things. And then most recently, there's a new concept of special program credits, which is a way for us to, I'll use the word arbitrary and then explain why it's not arbitrary. It's a way for us to assign an arbitrary additional credit bonus to an organization based on other programs we've developed that we might not be able to we can't just count issues for it. So in this case, the main place it's being used now is for the Starshot initiative to create Drupal CMS. We have some number of work tracks that are part of CMS, like creating the event recipe, working on the trial experience, all these different things that people are doing, working on Experience Builder. And there's all these individuals and companies that are backing up and sponsoring those trials, right? So this special program system lets us say, hey, in addition to all of the organic credit that's going to come from using the credit system and so on, as it's intended, we're going to add these designated credit bonuses in return for these organizations' commitment to say, yes, we're going to spend the next 20 weeks on doing this, and we're going to allocate this many hours per week, et cetera, to add another layer of incentives. So there's that. Incentive management and adjusting for sort of bad faith or inauthentic contributions is something we've talked about before, so I won't go too deep into it. I think we've had whole episodes about it. But we're finding reasonably good balances, and we also added the ability to add a credit penalty. So we can, if we have an organization and we first approach with an educational message and so on and so forth, and try in good faith to get the things fixed, if we have to, we can be like, all right, well, for the next week, month, year, whatever, you have a negative 500 credits until the way you're approaching this shapes up. And fortunately, we haven't really had to get to that point, but I have used it a couple times. And so I think that's been helping. But the main thing here is we really saw the realization of that hope and that dream that was on Dries's napkin that he and Josh were doodling on in Austin, which was that, like, one day this would be the basis for knowing who the makers are in the community, right? It was kind of the precursor for understanding that and for creating the economy of Drupal around feeding those making organizations and encouraging that. And that's been really, really cool. And we see consternation in other communities, whether it's the WordPress community or really plenty of other open source communities, about not being able to do similar things, not being able to figure out who are the players who deserved to be highlighted and featured and sent business and who maybe aren't. And instead they may be resorting to less less kind of fundamentally fair methods of trying to manage those problems in the community, the maker and taker issues.
So I think the contribution credit system is one of the greatest innovations by the Drupal Association, to be honest. I think on an individual
Forget about that Drupal thing.
well, to be fair, they support Drupal and the building of Drupal, but the DA is not the one usually building
Yeah,
Drupal
yeah,
itself.
yeah, exactly.
But I think there's two sides to the contribution credit, aside from the abuse, which we, like you said, we've had whole shows. But there's the organizational contribution piece, right there, and I think that it does show your ranking on the marketplace or affect your ranking in the marketplace. I honestly think that most organizations use it more as a personal highlight, though, right? I
Yeah,
don't know how many companies are going to the marketplace and be like, I want a Drupal developer. Let me just pick from the top of the list. It's more like, hey, there's this RFP. We're replying. We're number 3 on the marketplace, and this shows our expertise in Drupal and how we're involved in the community and how how much we help that project. And then
right.
on a personal level, and this is for Martin because we talked about this weekend. So I want to pitch a really complex idea for you guys, uh, just to think about. But on a personal level, I mean, there's obviously some joy in getting credits, right? There's some incentive just for having credits. I mean, it's human nature. If I can show that I've done something, I want to do that. But from a practical standpoint, other than maybe looking for a job or something like that, there's not a whole lot. And Martin has pitched this a couple times, and I think it's kind of interesting, but he thinks that it might be interesting to be able to stake some of your credits as a bounty for other issues. So, for example, if you have
Yeah,
500 credits and you're like, "Hey, this bug in his," so he maintains Smart Date. He said, if there's a bug or a feature that he just doesn't know how to solve, if he could be like, I'm going to stake 10 of my credits on this issue and be like, anybody that helps me solve this gets that 10 credits divvied up. And I understand you're already thinking like, oh my God, how are we
no,
gonna
no,
keep
no.
that from being abused? But but I think it's interesting, like how do we make these contributions useful in other places? Because there's certainly issues that I've had, like I just don't have time to solve them in other modules, or I don't have, or the maintainer is not responding, and I don't want to take it over.
Yeah,
But being able to stake your own credits against them or use them,
You're
use
describing
them well.
Woofy.
What is
say
that?
what?
You're describing Woofy.
Uh,
You haven't heard the term Woofy before? Social
No.
credit as capital. I
No.
can't remember who coined it, but I know that Cory Doctorow had it in his short story novella "Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom." Um, and it's the idea of in a post money world, how do you buy things? Well, you buy things with your karma, if you will, and they called the name of the currency Woofy.
Interesting.
I'm gonna
Man,
read.
I feel old now. Nobody else knows this? Okay.
I haven't read that Cory Doctorow, but okay.
So I don't think he's the one who coined it, but it was in that particular story, which is a great story, by the way.
Yeah,
One other,
so that's Martin's pitch for, as somebody who contributes a lot of way as an individual, a way to
yeah, and I think so. My response to that again being, I have actually heard of that idea or something similar to it before. My other thinking about it is even just we have a larger problem space of how to bring attention, right? When there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of issues that exist, how do we bring attention to the ones that are actually sort of high priority? And at the moment, so far, kind of the best we've done is bring attention to whole projects that might be strategic priorities because they're part of the Starshot initiative or whatever. And we've briefly tried a couple bounty programs where we publish a blog post and say, hey, we picked 5 really important core issues that we need to bring attention to. And those are each going to get 5x the normal amount of credit or something like that. And those are like tiny little experiments there, but it's not a systematic solution like what you're proposing. And I kind of like the notion, but to your point, maybe the implementation is different. Maybe it's more like, maybe it's kind of an upvoting system, and the higher your credits are, or the more credits you spend, the higher an upvote you get. Who knows? But I do think it would be interesting. We could use some mechanism for bringing attention to those things that are important. And the cool thing about that idea, about Martin's idea, is that are important to the makers in the community, the people who are in the know about what's really, really needed. So,
Josh, I didn't know if you wanted to bring up the issue that you had mentioned in Slack.
Yeah. Christian, who maintains the group module, posted a Drupal.org issue, I think just yesterday, maybe the day before. But I commented on it yesterday because I just thought it was interesting. But he was talking about, usage plays into the current algorithm so that, if something is heavily used, a project is heavily used, that's what weighs its credits, right? And he was talking about, well, technically group module isn't installed on as many Drupal sites, but the sites it's installed in are massive.
right.
And so how do we weight things based on the idea that this module is important to the ecosystem, commerce, group,
ECA, web form. Yeah.
Web form. I think about all the different government distros, local gov CMS, the US Digital Service Design System, those sorts of things, those are critical to the stability and kind of like long-term viability of Drupal, because those big installations will live on for a very long time. So how do we support making sure that those installations can stay up to date? And the other thing I thought about is like, there are so many modules that I love the functionality of that aren't stable yet. They're still sitting in alpha for 3 years, whatever it is. Can we like weight those to get them to stable so that we're, kind of promoting stable
Credit
modules
for
in the
stable
ecosystem?
releases. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that would be huge. So
Yeah.
it's a great issue. I'll drop it in the show notes so that you can include it and let the listeners take a look at it and maybe weigh in.
One thing that's not lost on me or is kind of near and dear to my heart is the fact that even in the early phases of the credit system, the thought of non-code contribution, right? Of like, hey, this is more than just code, like a code base, it's a community, was tied into the credit system, right?
Yeah.
So not making it solely based on commits, right? Or coupling it very tightly to the code that's being written is one of the things that as somebody who cares very deeply about non-code contribution, I appreciate that foresight and being able to say like, hey, this has got to evolve as not the code base evolves, but as the community evolves. So
100%.
I think that's pretty awesome.
Josh, when you were CTO, all those years ago, what was your proudest moment as CTO? What was the biggest achievement that you, other than hiring Tim, what was your biggest achievement?
I mean, hiring Tim was up there. The fact that, in 2016, when we had to restructure the DA to make it a smaller, more sustainable sized organization, when we basically realized this is the right size for the amount of revenue, which I'm sure over the years that size has changed based on, the realities of the world. I can only imagine what it was like going through the pandemic at the DA. But yeah, to know that I was like passing the baton to Tim was huge. So that's definitely up there. Tim's awesome. My proudest moment is probably the launch of Drupal 8, because we had to do. I know that the DA doesn't contribute the code, but if we did not have Drupal CI, if we didn't have Fastly fronting our CDN, allowing us to kind of scale to the scale that we needed for delivering the composer facade and some of those other things. Then Drupal 8 would not have launched when it did. And it was late when it did launch. I mean, like, it was one of those, we've got to figure out a way to get Drupal 8 out the door because we're losing momentum. And that was such a focus, was what can we do to make it so that Drupal 8 launches? So the fact that it launched then, and by the way, I don't even think Drupal 8 was viable when we launched it to build a site on. I didn't use Drupal 8 professionally for another 2 years after I left the DA, so maybe like the 2018 timeframe. And even in 2018, it was not super easy to use to build a new site. I mean, I think that there was this incubation period that needed to happen. But now, I mean, such an amazing platform to build on. It's one of those things where, when 9 and 10 released, that's I think we're beginning to get some momentum in that space in terms of really being viable for so many more things. But yeah, that for me, that Drupal 8 launch, just because it was so hard to get to, was probably the proudest moment.
Can you talk a little bit more about, so this is the part that's really interesting to me. So like, as a community member, like I saw a lot of the struggle, a lot of the work that went into the kind of code side of Drupal. Other than like, what's going on behind the scenes? Like, how do you set up a composer facade? How do you test that and make sure that it works? Like, those are the types of things that are really interesting to me, because I've used Composer. I've never set up a composer other than I'm using like packages or something, or how do you test something like that and make sure that it's not going to fall over?
The number of times we were told in that time, why aren't you just on GitHub? Why aren't we just on Packagist? Like, that was always the question. And the answer is because Drupal actually has a lot of things that are very specific to how it's constructed that make it different than, just this random package sitting on GitHub.
We can have sub packages was one of the main ones, right?
Yeah.
There's sub projects. There's no concept of that in Packagist. So the fact that you can use Composer with sub projects in Drupal is entirely because of the Composer facade that we have. And I think more of the folks that Josh hired, Ryan Aslett, who's also at the Linux Foundation now, and things like that, were folks who looked at this problem space and said, okay, well, we need Composer. There are these community-driven tools that were built to try and figure out a way to do this, kind of parsing from the updates XML on Drupal.org and figuring out how to do something. But we need to build something that's integrated into the packaging pipeline that's already part of Drupal for making releases, and publishes these flat files and all this kind of stuff. And like, there's a lot of this where it's breaking new ground, where a lot of the engineering that we did in those days and some of it that we do now is not Drupal engineering. It's writing this PHP code to generate a Packagist facade, a composer facade. It's writing custom CI elements and stuff like that. And it had to do a lot with solving new problems, a lot with looking at what other projects might be doing or other services that existed that couldn't support us, but at least had some architectural clues. And then testing it with the community behind the scenes. And it was definitely not always an easy thing or an easy conversation, for sure.
So, Tim, let's ask you the same question. What is your proudest or most profound moment as CTO? And let me add the enhancer there. Do you think you've hit it yet?
So I think no, partly because I don't think we've hit it yet, just because my tenure is now 10 years with the DA, and almost every project, going back to the ones originally kicked off and led by Josh, are these cumulative things that have been building on top of each other to create a more robust community home, right? So one of the major milestones that I certainly was very proud of is when we first got the initial GitLab deployment for merge requests, for all those kinds of things. I think that was a huge velocity increase for the community. Adding the GitLab CI onto that and working with a variety of contributors and core maintainers, especially Catch, to figure out how to adjust the way that it was processed and parallelized to get those tests back down from an hour and 15 to now between 5 and 15 minutes. Like that was an enormous productivity improvement for the whole community. But there's a lot of other things. What I'm most proud of is honestly the people on the team and the like the scope of what a small team can do for the community. Right now, the engineering team is 5.
People.
And yep, and it's folks who can. Again, we're mostly not doing Drupal projects. We're mostly writing special integration, like connector code between GitLab and Drupal.org, or we're writing all sorts of things that might be going on. We're writing things related to the auto updates, security endpoints, and all these things. And then we're also doing the new Drupal.org and those kinds of things. But like being able to work with a team, several of whom go back to Josh's original hiring era still.
Before my hiring.
Yeah, actually.
Both Neil and Brendan are before
even predate you.
before I
Yeah.
started. Yeah.
So and are still on the team today, right? They're both at the like 13-year mark or something like that, which is A, super rare in tech. And B, just really impressive considering the fact that we have always, even when we had a team of 11 engineers, we have always been outnumbered by the scale of our community and the needs of what we have. And the fact that this team can do a job that when I'm having a bad day, I describe as, our job is moderating a giant comment section. Like that's my bad day.
Yeah.
Like they can do that job and still do some really cool things for the community. And I'm just super, super proud of those folks. So
Awesome. Josh, did you anticipate the growth of kind of the community and the DA, when you first started as CTO, or were you kind of shocked by how quickly things took off?
I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't know what I was getting into. Whenever I started at the DA, I definitely didn't take it for financial reasons. In fact, I was probably better off staying in my cush government job at the time as an applications manager for a good sized county. I that first year was so much learning about what it means to have an open source community. Like I used open source a lot. I was probably more of a taker than a maker at the time. And just kind of learning like what levers you can pull and, the relationships that you had to build to get things to happen with an open source community like that was kind of huge. I mean, empirically, Drupal hasn't grown in terms of number of sites since that time. Like we hit the peak during that time with Drupal 7. And in fact, I was there at the time that Backdrop was released, and boy, that was an interesting board of directors conversation to have. Like, oh, hey, what's this challenge to Drupal 8 being successful? Everybody should be behind Drupal 8, So I guess at the time, I kind of assumed we were going to hit this velocity when Drupal 8 released, and it was going to just change everything. I think the reality of it is a little bit different, which is we've hit a different type of velocity, right? We've hit Drupal is used for really mission critical things now, and it's not used for my personal blog anymore. It's kind of this growth within a space that I think has been super lucrative for a lot of Drupal companies that have that have committed to this type of work. But it's not like it's not scaling in the same way that like some of the other things in the open source world have scaled. I don't know. I love that contribution has grown, because that's, I think, the thing that has grown more than anything else in the Drupal space, and that Drupal has been really good at is like bringing in more people to contribute, even if the relative age of that set of contributors is, it's aging up right now. That's kind of the reality of it. So, but it's still, I mean, I'm like super excited about it as a platform and what it gets used for, and how you can implement these amazing things with Drupal at scale that you just can't do with other projects that do content management. So,
yeah, I think you're highlighting one of the things that makes me most excited about Starshot. Like, I think you put it perfectly, right? Drupal just had and I think a lot of this has to do with the theming side, to be honest. It's hard to use Drupal for a small personal site unless you're okay with it looking like Olivero. And hosting is always a complication too, right? Because we have a build process. Now, the build process is great. I, like it makes Drupal stand out from some other CMSs that we won't mention, and it allows you to have reliability. Like I would never get rid of it, but it is a barrier to kind of those smaller sites, and those smaller sites were where a lot of people got first introduced to Drupal, and were a good way to test things out and tinker. But yeah, and I think that's what Starshot. Unless I have completely missed everything about Starshot, I think one of the coolest things about it is it's hoping to bring a lot of that back too,
It will
as well
open that
as
up.
just yeah,
Yeah.
just be a nicer way to get started.
Yeah, that build process you just described is still like, I didn't have my head completely wrapped around that 10 years ago, but now having worked in enough projects where I'm seeing other pieces of software that we have to integrate with, and those other pieces of software have like a dev instance and a prod instance, and you copy and paste between the two. And then the Drupal teams I'm working with have a full CI process, continuous integration. They're doing feature branches. We've got multiple developers contributing to a single mono repo. Like all of that is super, super powerful. Drupal has all that because of all the work that goes into that infrastructure. Drupal.org makes that possible. Like if we didn't have that structure, we wouldn't have the build processes that make us super professional compared to a lot of the other applications out there. And I'm including applications like ServiceNow, Salesforce, like the implementations I've seen of those, you don't deploy changes like Drupal does. You don't have the idea of immutability and being able to push something up the chain and know it's going to work. Those are all much less stable. They're fragile systems, if you think about it. And so like that all kind of goes back to that infrastructure and having the ability to have the composer facade, the mindset of a test-driven development sort of space. It's pretty powerful.
So Josh, other than calling Salesforce and ServiceNow fragile, during your tenure as CTO, if you could have done something differently, what would it have been?
Just one thing.
We're gonna. Sorry, that's all we got time for.
Oh God. Okay. Honestly, I wish I had understood some of the economics of being able to do some of the fundraising parts. Tim, I've seen you do just an awesome job of getting people to contribute their time and talent, and often their money to the Drupal Association in order to make some of these projects happen. And that, I wish I had known that first year that in addition to all the hiring, I needed to be doing at least 50% fundraising to make all that really viable. Because that is such a huge part of what the Drupal Association has to do just to make that whole stack continue to be available. So that's my message for today. Give to the Drupal Association, please.
You can become
join the Drupal Association.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And Tim, kind of the same question for you, but maybe looking a little more forward. Like, now that we've kind of done a retrospective on the job of CTO, any plans to tweak things, change things going forward that kind of pop into mind?
I mean, honestly, I had a different answer in mind, and then Josh gave his, and I'm like, nope, still need to do that one. We still need to be good at fundraising to support all this stuff. That's still huge. I think one of the things that I'd actually genuinely like to do differently is, and this is going to sound like I'm just repeating kind of the get off the island thing, but it's not what I mean. I kind of mean like look at some other islands while we go. One of the reasons that it's actually very motivating for me to do these shows, probably why I've done like 15 in the past, is because we have an infinite backlog. We talked about the infinite conveyor backlog back when Josh was with us about these things that we're always doing. And so we always move on to the next big priority. And like we do this initial GitLab deployment and we're moving on to the next thing. We're trying to get CI ready, all this stuff. And like some of those things are genuinely awesome and impactful. And we don't take enough time to celebrate them and enough time to look at some other projects out there or even other like enterprise software programs and go, oh, wait a minute. Not only is it really cool just in its own right, but we're maybe doing better than they are in this place. Maybe that's a competitive advantage we should be crowing about or speaking to or pointing to. Or at the very least, maybe we should be pausing enough to give ourselves that motivating pat on the back and feel like, no, it's not that we're behind on a backlog of all our ambitions, which may be true, but we're also ahead in several different ways. And going back to this conversation about the architecture of modern Drupal and what's coming with CMS, like I think everyone wishes all of these things could have come together faster, but like all this foundational work in terms of the capabilities of modern Drupal only made it possible really in the last year to even put this concept of the Starshot version of Drupal CMS on the table, right? All those necessary pieces only just exist. And like that's exciting to me because I feel like Drupal CMS is probably going to like recapture or really have its own version of that kind of Drupal 7 like adoption scenario with all of the things that are going on. So anyway, what I would do differently is I'd love to look outside ourselves and outside of our community to judge our success a little bit more, because I think it would just help keep up that motivation and also maybe catch us before we run down the wrong path, which would be a good thing too.
So, Tim, what do you see in the future for the Drupal Association CTO? I mean, just in this conversation, we've seen, amazing growth in your 8-year tenure as the CEO, CTO, excuse me. Josh kind of set it in motion, and then you've kind of taken it. By the way, I look forward in 2 years of having a CTO birthday cake at DrupalCon. Just an idea. Just an idea.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, what does it look like for the third CTO of the Drupal Association?
That's a really good question. And it's interesting to me because we have become increasingly involved. So one of the things that Josh pointed out that I want to expand on is a lot of this professionalizing of what Drupal can do, a lot of the reasons for its enterprise capabilities actually depend on services provided by Drupal.org. So increasingly, we said up front, like our mission is to empower the community to build Drupal, like we don't build Drupal directly. And that's sort of true, but in some ways it's becoming less and less true because enterprise grade software, even when we intend in the near future for it to become accessible to the small site builder again, requires these sort of SaaS-like services, whether it's for the auto updates, the project browser, all these kinds of things. So I think part of the ongoing CTO role is going to be actually a little bit of a product management part for those cloud components of Drupal, to put it that way. So I think that's definitely going to be a big thing, and we'll see how that role shakes out.
I mean, I've said this before, but I think the biggest thing the community is missing right now in terms of contribution is project management. I mean, if there could be a way to fund like a few project managers just to groom the issue queue and find duplicates.
Well, so I mean, they're already sort of doing that, right? So the DA has a product manager. Is that the right term, Tim?
We brought on Lenny Moskalik, who was actually previously a community elected board member and member of the community, and a big part of the Ukraine community. And she came on as what we're calling a delivery manager right now.
Delivery manager.
And she's doing, let's say, an experimental version, a kind of initial test version of kind of what you're talking about, Nick, scoped just to Starshot, and just to some of those tracks. And we're learning that even with that scope, she can't do it all, right? There's other people involved, other people with project management expertise, other product owners like Pam, like CK Rena, like others on the Starshot leadership team who are also participating in this. But yeah, that's coming a long way. I think there's a tools part of that too. When we finally get GitLab issues, those will have Kanban boards. That'll make a difference in all sorts of things. But yeah, I think that's an interesting concept, but figuring out the scalability of that is tricky. and how that ties into, it's tough to get people to sponsor backlog grooming, right? And therefore funding those positions can be hard. But yeah, I think that's worthwhile. I think there is this sense of we're doing something. There's something kind of magical is happening with the way the DA is acting as connective tissue between certified partner organizations and other contributor organizations and the actual work to be done, that we should figure out how to scale and replicate.
Awesome.
And don't forget, give.
Yes, you can
Exactly.
help support that work by becoming a Drupal Association member or encouraging your organization to become a certified partner or increase their partner level.
Well, Tim, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on. And Josh, thank you for joining us for the last 4 weeks as guest host.
It's been fun. Thank you, guys.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing Become a Patron. All right, Tim, if our listeners want to get in touch with you or check out your book, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. I'm Hestenet pretty much everywhere online except on Twitter, where I'm at Tim Lehnen. And you can reach me there. You can also find me on the Drupal Association staff page, of course, drupal.org/association/staff. And if you are interested in my fiction, you can go to aspenthornpress.com and check out Fog and Fireflies.
Great. And Josh, if our listeners want to get in touch with you?
And you should be interested in Tim's fiction because it is really good. Yeah, I'm Josh Awami on Drupal.org and also on Drupal Slack. Feel free to hit me up. I'd love to work with you.
And John, how about you?
You can find me at Picozzi.com, on Drupal.org as John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixman, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks,
Next
everyone.
week.
Awesome. Thanks.
Bye, y'all.